initiator, substance, and fulfillment. I appreciate the songs that were led this morning because they all talk about the way in which Christ is the all in all. He is the one who fulfills every need. He fulfills it because He initiated it. He started it. He is the one that sustains it throughout all of existence. And He is the one who gives it actual meaning or substance. And He is the one who will complete it in the end. He gives it fulfillment. And so that's why we're going to be talking about those words this morning. If you open your Bibles to Revelation 1, that's where we saw the first occurrence of this phrase, Alpha and Omega. And it's interesting, as I said a few moments ago, that that phrase, Alpha and Omega, is not used that many times in Scriptures. It's actually found only 4 times in Scriptures. 3 in some versions, but 4 in the New King James. Revelation 1 verse 8 is the one that was read a few moments ago. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, says the Lord, who is and was and who is to come, the Almighty. Verse 11 in the New King James has Him repeating that by saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. What you see, write it in the book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia. And it's important to take note here at the very, very beginning of Revelation that when Jesus uses this phrase, that He is the Alpha and the Omega, He is setting the stage for what is about to be written to these churches, these congregations who are going through tremendous turmoil because of the persecution that has arisen against the Lord's body. Jesus says that He is the beginning and the end, and because of that, they are able to be steadfast. They are able to be strong. They are able to have someone who's going to guide them through those troubled waters, and in the end, He's going to be able to deliver them. And so Jesus uses this phrase to let them know that He is the one who is, who was, who is, and is to come. That He was the beginning, He is the now, He is the future. That He is the initiator, that He is the substance, that He is the one who gives fulfillment to those things. And because of who Jesus is, these brethren, no matter what that persecution was, they were going to be able to overcome. They're not able to overcome because of their own strength and power, but because of who Jesus is. He is the Almighty. And so He is always with them. It's interesting that these 2 times that it's used are in the beginning. The other 2 times are at the end of the book of Revelation. Revelation 21 and verse 6, where you have the great scene before the throne where the ones who are parted left and right because of the names written in the book, and death and Hades are cast into hell, but those who are of the Lamb are accepted into God's presence, and that God wipes away all their tears. And it's in that context that it says in verse 6 of Revelation 21, He said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. The next chapter, chapter 22, as the book of Revelation draws itself to a conclusion and letting everyone know that the Lamb has overcome, it says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. So what does the phrase actually mean? Most of you probably already know, and you've probably heard before, that's the first and the last letters of the Greek alphabet, which is kind of like, I've always heard that and said, oh, okay, I don't know what that actually means, but okay. But in studying this, it's an echo. It's an echo back really to probably like the Hebrew alphabet that began and ended with a certain letter. But more than that, it was the idea that you see in Isaiah 44 and verse 6, where it says of God in the Old Testament that He's the King of Israel, the Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I am the first and the last. Besides me, there is no other God. And what it does is it points to the eternal nature of God, that from beginning to end, from everlasting to everlasting, from first to last, He is there. But more than that, it means that everything in between, we use the phrase in our language that they've covered all the bases from A to Z. Well, we don't mean that they covered the first and they covered the last. We mean they covered everything from A to Z. And so when you see this phrase, I am the Alpha and the Omega, it's not pointing to just the one who started something and just the one who's going to end something, but everything in between. Think about the human language. That everything that we communicate with one another is based upon 26 letters. All of our communication, 26 letters. With 26 letters, you can tear a person's character down, or you can inspire greatness with the same 26 letters. When Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, He means everything that needs to be communicated about who I am, about who God is, about what my purpose is communicated in that. And just like it would be that if you removed letters from that, it would be meaningless. It would be a bunch of jibber jabber. So it is with Christ as well. You can't take anything away from him. And you can't take anything away from who he is. You think about music, and music only has so many notes that are used. But with those few simple notes, you have tremendous symphonies, and you have this beautiful orchestrations that can elicit tears and great emotion from people. But think about how it is that this is not talking about just the eternal nature of Jesus, but also the essential nature of who he is. That just like music is not worth listening to if you start removing the notes, and communication can't take place if you start removing letters from the communication. Life has no meaning whatsoever without Jesus in it. That's what Jesus is saying. I am the Alpha and the Omega. You want to know how to make sense out of life in the midst of all this persecution, you churches of Asia? You want to know how to make it through tremendous persecution and hardship and difficulty? You want to know how to find the purpose behind all of that persecution and what it's going to mean for you in the future? It's about me, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the one who was, who is to come, the Almighty. He is the all in all. That's what the phrase is talking about, and that's what it means. That to me was extremely encouraging, because there's so often where you sit with someone and their life just seems to be weary and scattered, like sheep having no shepherd, as Jesus looked out at the multitudes of his time. And Jesus had compassion on them because he wanted to lead them and guide them as a good and gentle shepherd. And it was the shepherd that was going to protect them and guide them and bring them into a sheepfold. He was going to be the one that in his hand no one could pluck them out. He gave life meaning and purpose because he's the Alpha and the Omega. And that's what it means for all of us as well. So what are some of the things that Jesus is Alpha and Omega over? One of the first things that you notice is he is the beginning and end over all of creation. The Bible is full of richness when it comes to Jesus' role in creation. And in John 1, which is echoing back to Genesis chapter 1, John says in his gospel account that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In 2 Peter 3 and verse 5, Peter reminds us that not only is he the one who began all these things, but he is the one who's going to bring all these things to an end as well. Then in 2 Peter 3, Peter says, "For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and into water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of godly men." And so Jesus is the one who was there before these things were created. He will be there long after these things are destroyed. He is the eternal. But everything in between, the substance of who Jesus is for, especially in this passage in the context, that man might be saved from his sins. Don't willfully forget that with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. Time is a meaningless thing to him. These things are being held together because of him, so that each and every person has that perfect opportunity to be saved. And so if we are lost, it is completely because we have chosen to be lost, but not because of him. Because he is the one who is the beginning, and he is the one who is the end. He is the Alpha and the Omega. You see, therefore, when you think about this, what does that mean for me? That because Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, then, it means that I have my very existence. The only reason I even exist today is because of him. That throughout my life has meaning and purpose, that I'm not just walking aimlessly, and I can't have this idea floating through my mind that there's nothing to live for, because there's so much to live for. I live for the Alpha and the Omega. I live for the beginning and the end and the substance of everything in between. And because of that, I have hope in this life. In Acts 17, verse 26, Paul said it this way, that he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord and hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our very being. Because Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, I live, I move, I have my very being because of that. Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega over all of God's revelation as well. You remember in John 1, and this is interesting, and I went back and looked at these passages again this past week, that in John 1 and several other passages, it talks about how Jesus was talked about in the Old Testament, and specifically in Moses. And not just in specific words, as in prophecies, but also in some allusions and some examples that were used. In John 1, verse 45, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote." And he pointed out that that was Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. In John 5, Jesus himself said, "Do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" The words that Jesus uses there in John 5 are so strong because Jesus says, my words carry as much and more meaning than what Moses wrote about. Moses wrote about me. And you say you believe in what Moses wrote, but Moses wrote about me. And every word of my mouth is just as powerful and more so than anything that Moses ever wrote. They knew exactly who Jesus was claiming to be. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He's the beginning and the end. He is the great I am. And because of that, he could speak with such authority and such power. In Luke 24, there's two examples of this. When you have Jesus talking to the people on the road to Emmaus, and he says that beginning at Moses and all the prophets, that he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. With his disciples later in verse 44, he says, "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets, and not just those things, but also the Psalms concerning me." So Jesus points to, and this is basically what he's saying for us, every page of your Old Testament was about Jesus. It's all talking about him. It's all moving toward him. It's all pointing toward him. It's all about how it is that God would have us to be, have his people to be, and ultimately how they can be because of Jesus Christ. This is who Jesus was supposed to be from the beginning. This is who God was pointing to from the beginning. This is who everyone was talking about. And that's when Jesus came into the scene. He said everything, the Moses, the prophets, and even the Psalms, it was all speaking about me. He did not deny it. And so you have a few examples as well that you wouldn't think about, like in John 3 and verse 14, where Jesus is in that midst of the discussion with Nicodemus. And in the midst of that, John says in verse 14, that just like the serpent was lifted up by Moses in the wilderness, so the Son of Man has to be lifted up. All of them were bitten by the serpent. All of us were bitten by the serpent. They were all bitten by this fiery serpent that had to be cleansed by looking to this brazen object off the ground. All of us have to be saved from the serpent by looking to Jesus who hung upon the cross. That was there. But who would have thought about it when they read those things? Jesus talks about in John 6 in verse 32, in the midst of talking about being the bread of life, he said, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven." So Jesus even says that back then when our fathers were eating the manna in the wilderness, that bread that came from heaven, Moses wasn't giving that to you. God was giving that to you. And the lesson was this, is that God is going to sustain you. He's going to be there for you. He's going to give you what you need. And what you need more than anything else is not bread, or as Jesus was doing a miracle to give physical bread, what you need is the true bread from heaven, which Jesus says is him. And why is that? Because he's the Alpha and he's the Omega. And all things were pointing toward him along the way. So what does that mean for us? In Hebrews 1 verse 1, God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds. It means that we're supposed to be listening to what it is that he has taught us, that God has spoken in a lot of different ways in times past. And it was in the Old Testament that the prophets and those who spoke, there were a lot of things they didn't understand. And I'm pretty sure that when they were picking up the manna in the wilderness, and when the serpent was lifted up and they had to look upon that to be healed from the poison, that they did not understand that that was pointing to Jesus Christ. But in our day and time, everything has been made clear and made plain. And we can understand. The mystery has been revealed, and we have it all for us in our scriptures. In Revelation 22, that's why it is said that we are not to add anything to or to take away anything from. Because if we add to, all the plagues that were there are going to be added to you. If you take away, your name's going to be taken away from the book of life. And stern warning is given that when Jesus speaks, you listen to him. And you don't add anything to it. And you don't take anything away from it. That he is the one who binds. He is the one who loosens. Because after all, he is the Alpha and he is the Omega. He is the beginning and the end and everything in between. So again, what that means for us is that means that when I read the scriptures, I have been introduced to God. That when I read about Jesus and see who he was and what he did and how he interacted with people, that introduces me to who God really is. Jesus even told his disciples that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And when we read the scriptures, it talks about, as Paul with the Corinthians, that a veil is lifted so that we can see plainly what the prophets of old were talking about and moving toward with Jesus. It means that all things that we need pertaining to both life and godliness have been provided. And because of that, it means that we have a glimpse even into eternity. Because if this life only I have understanding and knowledge, I still feel very uneasy and insecure. But because Jesus is not just the one who came and then died, but he was resurrected and he ascended to the Father in heaven. And he says that where I am, there you will be also. And it gives us a glimpse into eternity. God is the Alpha and Jesus is the Alpha and Omega over all of God's revelation. He tells us everything that we need to know and lets it be known for our encouragement and strength. Romans chapter 6 is a beautiful chapter that we look upon so often to talk about what baptism is all about. And it's appropriate when we think about him being the Alpha and the Omega over our salvation. In verse 3, do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also shall walk in newness of life. For if we've been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we also shall be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. For he who has died has been freed from sin. Now if we died with Christ, we believe that we also shall live with him, knowing that Christ, having been raised from the dead, dies no more. Death no longer has dominion over him. And Paul uses this language throughout the rest of this letter to encourage all brethren to think about who it was, the form of doctrine that you were delivered by. And that by doing that, you dedicated yourself to a risen Savior. Not to someone who just died, but someone who was buried and was resurrected. That you didn't just die to sin, but you were raised to walk in newness of life. It wasn't just that Jesus started something in you. Jesus is going to help you complete that process by putting to death sin and always walking in accordance with the master you now serve. And just as it was that Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so in the end, we shall be raised glorious as well. We have great encouragement because of that. That's what echoes through the halls of heaven when a person is baptized. That all things have become new. And a life is going to be spent in service to God. Therefore, we have been rescued. That's what salvation is all about. We've been rescued from having that second death. We've been saved from our own sins. I've been, and I can be sustained throughout my life. Newness of life. The Colossian letter talks about how it was that we were translated from one kingdom to another. So as we walk through this life, it's not that God placed us or took us out of one kingdom and then placed us in another kingdom by ourselves. But we're sustained through that existence by Christ. And also, we know that when heaven when heaven's gates are open to those in the end, that we're going to be there. And that's a glorious thought, because Jesus began it, Jesus was there in the middle, and Jesus will be there in the end. And lastly, Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, I believe, over helping us maintain a faith that is steadfast, so that we're not always wavering. Jesus himself in Hebrews chapter 12, and this passage has a verse that we're going to look at the end of the month. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking to Jesus, and here's that phrase, the author and the finisher, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. When you think about the position that Jesus himself was in, brethren, when he went to the cross, and we've read the passages so many times that tell us the agony that he was going through and knowing what he was about to suffer. He knew that that was his purpose when he came upon the earth, was to give his life. It was not by accident, and it was nothing that caught him by surprise, but it was also something that caused his fleshly body to cry out. But Jesus also knew what the end was going to be, that death was not going to be the end. Death was only the means to the end. The end was going to be joyous. And so what did Jesus do in order to make it through that difficulty, to give him strength in the midst of all that hardship, to help him make it through those hours upon the cross? Jesus looked forward to the joy that was set before him. And because of that, he endured the cross. It gave him that strength. Because of that, he despised the cross and the things that it was going to mean. And because of that, he was delivered. It's no different with us. He is the one who is the author and the finisher. He didn't just sit down and start writing the book and then leave it for someone else to finish. He wrote the book. He finished the book. He's not surprised by the book. He knows the book. He lived the book. And brethren, that's the same thing for us. We can endure because Jesus endured, but we must do it the same way, by knowing the end of the story. So Paul says to brethren like those in Philippi, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. And what encouraging language that is for all of us, that when you're going through those difficulties, when you feel like giving up, when you don't know if you can make it, that we can sit down and say, look, this is what Paul said to the brethren in Philippi. And the reason that Paul said that to the brethren in Philippi is because of who Jesus is. Jesus did begin a good work in you, and I am confident that he is able to finish it. Paul himself was able to say that because he himself said the same thing about himself. In 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12, for this reason I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed to him until that day. Paul knew who he believed in and had been persuaded. Think about the beginning of Paul's life, blinded on the road to Damascus. Think about the middle of his life when he's in a prison because of preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. And at midnight, he's singing and others are hearing it. You think about 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul talks about all those different hardships and difficulties he goes through because of preaching Jesus Christ. And he says, yet what comes upon me daily is my deep concern for all the churches. And then you think about Paul at the end of his life saying to Timothy, I have finished the race. I've kept the faith. There's laid up for me a crown of life. Paul says, I have done those things which God has asked me to do, and now I'm ready for that final reward. And it's not just for me, but for all those who love his appearing. The reason that Paul says it is because Paul understood that there was one who began that work in him and the one who will finish that work in him. Brethren, there was somebody who began that work in you. That was not you who saved yourself and that you had the power yourself and that you somehow overcame sin all by yourself. It was faith in the working of God when you were baptized that delivered you from that body of sin, did it not? And that same God will complete that work in you. But you have to trust in him. And you have to look toward him. And you have to listen to him because he is the Alpha and he is the Omega. In Revelation 2 and verse 7, this is one of many places where John writes through the Spirit, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear. Let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give to eat from the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. We use that to talk about how it is that we're supposed to listen to God. But put it in the context. The context is Jesus saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega. If you have an ear to hear, listen to what I am saying. So, brethren, here's what I want us to think about in conclusion. Who is it that you're listening to? Are you listening to those who are discouragers, those who bring you down, those who say you can't make it or give you reasons why it's going to be too difficult for you? Or are you listening to someone who began, who will end, who has always existed, who is the Almighty, who says, yes, you can. I began that work in you. I will finish that work in you. You going through persecution, churches of Asia, people putting you to death? I began the work in you. I will finish the work in you. And even if they take your life, what have they done but hasten your arrival into the gates of heaven? I am the first and the last. I will wipe away all the tears from your eyes. You're thirsty? Come to me. I'm the one who created the living water. I am the bread that came down from heaven. I'm the true bread. What are you lacking that can't be fulfilled in Jesus Christ? I am the Alpha and the Omega. Everything in between, everything that you need to know about God is fulfilled in those simple letters between Alpha and Omega. And there's nothing else that you need other than what's in between there. And that's who Jesus is. And so that's the question I'm going to leave with you this morning is, who are you listening to? I pray to God that when we think about who Jesus is, it helps us and encourages us to face whatever that difficulty may be. But it would also encourage us that if we've been looking for the courage to obey the gospel, to become a child of God, because maybe you're afraid that you're not going to have enough power to complete it, the one who begins a good work in you is able to complete it. Don't trust in yourself. Trust in God who saves. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, and if we can help you in any way, please come this morning that we can help you. As together we stand and sing, won't you please come?